Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Daily Faith Builder. One of the greatest causes of confusion in our life, especially our spiritual life specifically, is not understanding the source and the purpose of suffering in our lives. It is key for us to understand that there are at least 7 different kinds of suffering specifically that we find in the Bible. And oftentimes we deal with suffering the same way in our lives. We lump everything into the category of suffering, but that keeps us from really understanding and be able to process with God through holding on to his promises and faith and moving through in a healthy way through those times of suffering. So it's when we start to understand the source of our suffering and we start to understand what is behind our suffering specifically that we're able to lean into the promises of God and we're able to actually pursue some healing in the process. I just want to introduce the 7 main types of suffering that we find in the Bible. These aren't an exhaustive list, but these are the main ones that are key for us to understand, especially when we're going through a suffering time, that we can lean in and learn from that and hold on to God's promises and come out of that suffering in the sense of understanding the purpose of why we're going through it. There's 7 of these. Let me just introduce these, and then we're going to tag these later as we go through this week and talk about these individually a little bit more. But the first one is suffering as a result of sin. All suffering ultimately is a result of sin. We'll talk about that in a little more detail, but there is a suffering that is directly related to our sin and just the sin in the world. The other one is suffering as a result of the Father's discipline. We see this in Hebrews 12. The Father disciplines those that he loves, and it's key for us to understand in suffering that we're going through is this directly from the Father's hand of his loving discipline in my life, or is this a result, of something else? The third one is suffering as a result of injustice. Injustice, we see it all through the scripture, is suffering because of the injustice, which is obviously another result of sin in the world, but is a very specific type of suffering that we see that people have gone through in the scriptures. The next one is suffering as a result of demonic activity. And it is critically important that we're able to understand and discern and learn that this is demonic attack and that we're able to hold on to the specific promises that we have in scripture, to fight off that type of suffering and to grow in the midst of that. The next one is suffering as a result of persecution. What we know is that is a unique type of suffering that only followers of Jesus experience, that is a result of persecution because of our faith in Jesus. We see this obviously all in the New Testament. The vast majority of suffering that's spoken of in the New Testament falls into actually that category. We'll talk about that later. Suffering as a result of divine judgment. We see this all through the scripture where God actually brings judgment upon nations, cities, people in his time of justice. We'll talk about that. It's critical for us to understand. And the last one is just suffering as a result of divine mystery, where we see in the Psalms and others that there's seasons of wilderness that God sends us in that we might not know specifically what the purpose of that suffering is. And we have to just hold on and trust God for a certain period of time until God brings that clarity. And so these are 7 of the key types of suffering that we find in Scripture, and they are. It's critical for us to understand and have discernment and grow in understanding which one of these that we're in the midst of. We ask God to lead us by the Spirit so that we can grow through these times and apply God's promises in the midst of these things. And so I hope that encourages you and gives you something to think about today, especially we think about going through this COVID pandemic right now. Well, we'll talk about in the next couple of days, where does it possibly fall? Because every one of these actually we could be experiencing in a different way, through this time. So anyway, we're going to drill in on that. That's just a little intro. I hope that encourages, gives you something to think about today, that God gives us the resources to understand each of these 7 things and the promises to hold on to come out of these sufferings in victory, in a place of growth, in a place of strength with him when we lean into his promises through those times of suffering. God bless. Hope you have a wonderful day.